The unexpected stop-it was a typical afternoon at the airport, the kind where the hum of busy travelers filled the air, each person absorbed in their own world, darting between gates and baggage claim. The high ceilings echoed with voices, distant conversations, the screech of suitcases rolling over the floor, and the occasional beeping of the self-checkout machines at kiosks. Jasmine, dressed in a business casual ensemble, moved through the terminal, her mind on the meeting she had just completed. The flight had been long, and the nerves of work had been left behind. She was looking forward to getting back home to her husband Marcus, who always knew how to make her feel grounded after such chaotic days. Her only task now was to grab her luggage and head out to meet him. She didn't know what was about to unfold. A day like any other, quickly turning into something she could not have anticipated. Jasmine stood by the carousel, her hands loosely folded in front of her. She glanced at her watch, the minute hand ticking forward, and her suitcase was nowhere in sight. She sighed softly, her tired eyes taking in the faces around her. She had been traveling often lately, a rhythm she had become used to, but there was something today that felt off. Perhaps it was the weight of exhaustion from too many days on the road, or the quiet, nagging feeling in her gut. A glance at her phone told her Marcus was already on his way, waiting outside the airport for her to arrive. He'd always been punctual, always there to support her. She smiled at the thought of him, trying to push away the strange feeling building within her. The minutes ticked by. The carousel slowed, then stopped. Jasmine felt her pulse quicken. Where was her suitcase? There were only a few people still waiting around her, the crowd thinning as the majority of travelers had already left. She checked the conveyor belt again, her eyes searching for the black suitcase she had packed with care. It wasn't there. She felt a wave of irritation and confusion rise within her, but before she could act, she felt eyes on her. Out of nowhere, two uniformed officers appeared beside her. Their presence was so sudden, so jarring, that Jasmine froze for a moment, her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't noticed them approach, hadn't seen the subtle movement of their heads toward her, but there they were, standing right next to her, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a tall man with dark features, spoke first. "Ma'am, could you step aside for a moment?" The tone of his voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that immediately set Jasmine on alert. She looked up at him, then over at his partner, a shorter officer with a stocky build and a scrutinizing gaze. Her heart began to race, and the knot in her stomach tightened. This wasn't right. She had done nothing wrong. Nothing that would warrant being stopped by the police at an airport. She hadn't even left the baggage area yet. But the unease was now settling deeper into her chest, the heaviness of something unspoken hanging in the air. Jasmine nodded slowly, forcing herself to maintain composure as she moved away from the carousel. She walked alongside the officers, her thoughts a blur. What could this be about? Was it a routine check, something normal for everyone else? Her instinct told her it wasn't normal, that this wasn't a random security measure, but she couldn't figure out why they were bothering her specifically. Once they reached a quieter section of the terminal, the officers stopped. Jasmine stood still, wondering if she should say something, asking why they were doing this. She had never been in this position before, not like this. She glanced around, but there was no one else nearby, no one to witness this strange encounter. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out how to handle this. She had heard of people being detained for random checks, for luggage inspections, but this didn't feel like that. Not at all. "Ma'am, could you please hand over your ID?" The taller officer spoke again, his voice cutting through her thoughts. Jasmine hesitated for a moment before reaching for her purse. She pulled out her wallet, her fingers trembling slightly, and handed over her ID without speaking. The officer took it from her, scanning it briefly before handing it back without another word. His partner stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching her closely. His stance was rigid, like he was ready for something to happen, though Jasmine couldn't figure out what. She wanted to ask them what was going on. She wanted to demand to know why she had been stopped, but her voice caught in her throat. What if they didn't answer? What if they became aggressive? The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken questions and uncertainties. Jasmine had heard stories, seen the headlines about people being stopped, questioned, harassed for no reason other than how they looked or where they were from. She had never thought it would happen to her, not in a place like this, not in an airport where everything seemed so structured, so orderly. As the seconds dragged on, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The officer's silence only amplified her fear. The longer they stood there, the more uncomfortable she became. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to push the anxiety down, but it was difficult. The nagging suspicion that she was being judged for something beyond her control crept up, and she couldn't stop the chill running down her spine. One of the officers spoke again, but it wasn't a question. It was more of a statement, something she couldn't ignore. "Do you mind if we ask what brought you to the city today?" His voice was softer, but there was still an undercurrent of authority in it. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat, her mind scrambling to piece together her response. Was this some kind of interrogation? She was a businesswoman, here on a work trip, but why did they need to know that? Why wasn't she being allowed to leave? She tried to focus, but everything felt like it was slipping through her fingers. "I was just here for a business meeting," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves twisting inside her. She swallowed, trying to keep her composure. "I'm just waiting for my luggage." The officers exchanged a look, one that didn't go unnoticed by Jasmine. She caught it, the brief glance that seemed to say more than words ever could. Something was off. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she felt it in the pit of her stomach. "All right, ma'am, thank you for your cooperation," the first officer said finally, his tone shifting to something less hostile, but no less guarded. He nodded at his partner, who remained silent, still watching her with a sharp eye. Jasmine wasn't sure what to think. They had no reason to question her, no reason to treat her this way, but somehow they were doing it anyway. "Can I go now?" Jasmine asked, her voice edged with frustration. The officer didn't respond. Right away, his eyes still on her, scanning her face like he was looking for something. Jasmine had no idea what it was he expected to find, but the unease was becoming unbearable. The silence between them was almost suffocating, each moment stretching out like an eternity. "I'm just waiting for my luggage," she repeated, trying to maintain her composure. "I haven't done anything." The officer finally nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You're free to go once we finish our checks." Jasmine stood there, her mind whirling. She wanted to protest, wanted to ask for clarification, but something held her back. Maybe it was the power dynamics of the situation, the way they were in control and she was at their mercy. Or maybe it was the dread creeping into her thoughts, whispering that this wasn't going to end the way she wanted. The longer she stood there, the more uncomfortable it became. She could feel her muscles tightening, the tension gnawing at her. It felt like an eternity before she heard a voice, but it wasn't from the officers. It was a familiar voice, one she knew well, one that made her heart race in a different way. Jasmine, she turned quickly, her eyes scanning the crowd. Her breath caught in her chest as she saw Marcus, her husband, striding toward her, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. She felt a rush of relief wash over her, but also a tightening knot in her stomach. There was more to this than she had realized. The truth was just beginning to unfold. A rising tension. Marcus's voice sliced through the tense silence of the airport terminal. He was there, standing in front of Jasmine, his eyes scanning the scene quickly, taking in the officers, their stern expressions, and the way the whole situation had unfolded. Jasmine's heart raced even faster as she saw him approach. His presence, so steady and confident, was a sudden relief, but it did nothing to ease the overwhelming tension that had been building up in her chest. The officers, still standing a few feet away from her, seemed to pause for a split second, their gazes shifting towards Marcus. The taller officer, who had been doing most of the questioning, took a breath as though he had been caught off guard. For the first time, Jasmine noticed that the tightness around his eyes seemed to soften, his stance becoming slightly less rigid. The shorter officer, who had been silent and watching from the corner, shifted his weight, crossing his arms tighter over his chest, as though bracing for whatever was about to happen. Marcus stepped closer, his gaze moving from Jasmine to the officers, his voice steady and calm. But there was an underlying sharpness to it that immediately put the officers on edge. "Is everything all right here?" Marcus asked, his tone direct, his eyes never leaving the officers as he came to stand by Jasmine's side. Jasmine's breath hitched, and a sense of calm spread over her as Marcus wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her slightly closer to him. His protective stance gave her the strength to stand tall, to hold her ground in a situation that had grown so unclear and uncomfortable. She leaned into him, allowing his presence to remind her that no matter what happened next, she wasn't alone. His words, as simple as they were, sent a message that Jasmine could feel reverberating through the air. This wasn't something they would just stand by for. The first officer, still trying to maintain some semblance of control, cleared his throat and stepped forward, his posture straightening a bit. "She's just being questioned, sir," the officer said, but his voice faltered slightly, as though the reassurance he was trying to offer was falling flat. "There's no reason to be alarmed." Jasmine could feel the officer's discomfort growing with every word. They had expected a different response, one that would allow them to continue questioning her without anyone intervening. But Marcus wasn't just anyone. He wasn't the kind of person who would stand by and allow someone to be treated unjustly without challenging it. His gaze was sharp, the kind of look that made people pause, the kind that left no room for lies or misdirection. "Why was my wife stopped?" Marcus's voice was low, but it carried weight. It wasn't a question, it was a demand for an answer. The officers hesitated, exchanging another glance. The moment stretched on, long and uncomfortable. Jasmine could see the officers trying to read Marcus, trying to figure out what kind of response would placate him. But there was no easy answer to give. The taller officer shifted his weight, clearly stalling for time. "It's just a routine stop, sir," he said, his words coming out a little too quickly, like he was trying to brush off the situation. But the way his eyes darted around, avoiding Marcus's unflinching gaze, told a different story. Marcus didn't buy it. He never had. He had been trained to spot lies, to catch people trying to cover up the truth. And this wasn't a routine stop. Jasmine knew it, and Marcus knew it. They both felt it in the air. The way the officer's answers didn't quite add up, how the situation seemed to unravel with every passing second. There was something wrong here, something they weren't being told, something deeper than a simple check. Jasmine's stomach twisted as the realization hit her like a tidal wave. She had been stopped because of her appearance, because of who she was. They had decided she was a threat, or at the very least, someone to be investigated simply because she was there, standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. It wasn't a random check, it was something else, something more insidious. Marcus stepped forward, closer to the officers, his eyes narrowing. His voice was colder now, the warmth that had once been there, now replaced with a quiet fury. "You're telling me that you pulled her aside just because of a routine check, with no reason, no suspicion? You expect me to believe that?" The second officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking to his partner before returning to Marcus. There was no answer, none that could justify what was happening. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest, the anger beginning to rise inside of her. She didn't want to believe this was happening. She didn't want to believe that something as simple as her being black had led to her being treated this way. But the evidence was right in front of her. The officers' behavior, the way they had singled her out, the way they were trying to cover up their actions, it was all too familiar. "Ma'am," the first officer spoke again, his voice no longer as firm as before. "We're just following protocol. There's no need for this to escalate." But his words felt hollow, as though he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Jasmine clenched her fists at her sides. She could feel Marcus's hand on her shoulder, steadying her, grounding her, but inside she was shaking. The weight of the situation was heavy, oppressive. She had been stopped by the police for no reason other than the color of her skin. There was no other explanation, and she couldn't let them get away with it. "No," Marcus said, his voice unwavering. "This isn't just protocol. You stopped her for something else. Now, I want to know why." The officer faltered, his mouth opening and closing like he was searching for a way to justify his actions. But there was nothing. There was no explanation that could make this right. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Jasmine's eyes met Marcus's, and in that brief exchange, she felt the strength of his resolve. He wasn't backing down. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. The officer's partner shifted on his feet again, clearly uncomfortable. He cleared his throat and finally spoke, though his voice was quieter this time, almost sheepish. "We've had a few complaints about disturbances around here. We're just doing our job." Jasmine almost laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was bitter, a release of the frustration building inside her. Complaints, disturbances. Was that really the excuse they were going to use? What kind of complaints? Marcus pressed, his voice still calm, but with a sharp edge that demanded answers. "What exactly are you accusing my wife of?" The officer hesitated, his gaze shifting away. The truth was, he had nothing. There was nothing Jasmine had done that warranted this treatment. There was no justification for the way she was being singled out, no reason for her to be detained without cause, and the officers knew it, but they were hoping that if they could keep talking, keep stalling, maybe they could make this go away. But Marcus wasn't going to let it slide. "I'm asking you again," Marcus said, his tone now harder, colder. "Why was she stopped?" The second officer, who had been mostly silent until now, spoke up, his voice low and almost apologetic. "It was a mistake. We're sorry for the confusion, sir." But the apology didn't feel genuine. It felt forced, something they were saying because they had no choice, not because they truly believed they had done something wrong. Marcus wasn't satisfied with the half-hearted answer. He wanted the truth, and he wasn't leaving until he got it. Jasmine stood there, her mind swirling with emotions. She wanted to yell, to demand justice, but she knew that wouldn't solve anything. It would only make them more defensive, more dismissive. But the reality of the situation was settling in, and it was more painful than she could have imagined. She had been judged, not based on who she was, but based on what people assumed her to be, and that was the hardest pill to swallow. Marcus turned to her, his eyes softening as he saw the frustration and pain in her expression. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, pulling her close, offering her a silent promise that everything would be okay. She could feel the warmth of his presence, the steadiness of his touch, and for a moment, the weight on her chest lifted. No matter what happened next, they were in this together. They always had been, but Jasmine knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning, and they were about to find out just how deep the problem really went. The arrival of her husband, the cold air of the airport terminal seemed to freeze in place as Marcus's presence fully registered in the tense atmosphere. The officers, still standing rigid and uncertain, now found themselves in a new, unexpected dynamic. Jasmine could feel it instantly, the shift that came when Marcus stepped into the scene. His calm yet undeniable authority had a way of commanding attention, and for the first time, she noticed the subtle unease ripple through the two officers. Jasmine watched Marcus with a mix of relief and rising anxiety. His stature alone was enough to make people pause, but it was the intensity in his eyes that made everything about the situation feel different. He wasn't just a man walking up to check on his wife. He was a man who knew how to handle situations like this, a man who had spent years in the legal world, making sure justice was served. And now, he was bringing that same resolve to defend Jasmine. She could feel her chest tightening as he stood beside her, his arms slipping naturally around her shoulders, pulling her closer to him, as if creating an invisible barrier between her and the world. The simple act of him standing by her side was enough to remind her that she wasn't alone. But it also made the officers realize that things had just escalated to a point they hadn't anticipated. The first officer, who had initially been the one doing most of the questioning, stiffened the moment Marcus spoke. His words were calm but deliberate, like the sharp edge of a blade that didn't need to be drawn. "Is everything all right here?" Marcus asked, his voice cutting through the thickening tension. He wasn't asking for reassurance. He was demanding answers. The second officer, the one who had been standing further back with his arms crossed, stepped forward slightly, his gaze flickering from Marcus to Jasmine. The fear and discomfort were now visible on his face. For a moment, it seemed like both officers had no idea how to proceed. The quiet pause that followed felt heavy, like they were waiting for a storm to break. The taller officer, still trying to maintain some control, cleared his throat and gave a half-hearted nod. "She's just being questioned, sir. Nothing to worry about." His voice wavered slightly, betraying the unease he was clearly trying to mask. But Marcus wasn't fooled by the officer's forced calm. He had dealt with this kind of rhetoric before. He had seen it used as a shield, a way to deflect responsibility when there was no real justification for what was happening. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he took a step closer to the officer, his presence imposing and confident. "My wife has done nothing wrong, so I'm asking you again, why was she stopped? Why is she being questioned? What is the real reason behind this?" Youth officers exchanged another brief, nervous look, and for a moment, Jasmine thought they might remain silent, hoping the situation would resolve itself. But the tension was too thick for that. They could no longer ignore the force of Marcus's presence, the quiet authority in his voice that left no room for evasions or half-truths. The second officer finally spoke, his voice tinged with an edge of defensiveness. "We're just following standard procedure, sir. There's been some suspicion around this area, and we're doing routine checks." Routine checks. The words echoed in Jasmine's mind like an empty excuse. She had heard them before, always in situations like this, always when someone wanted to dismiss the truth and cover up their real intentions. The officer's explanations rang hollow in the air. The moment they had said those words, Jasmine could tell the officers knew they were on shaky ground. They were trying to mask the real reason they had pulled her aside, trying to cover up the fact that this wasn't a routine check at all. This wasn't a random stop. They had targeted her for a reason. Marcus didn't flinch at their answer. He stood taller, his gaze unwavering. Routine checks. Are you telling me that you randomly decided to stop my wife without any real cause? His voice was steady, but there was a sharpness in his words now, a quiet fury that was impossible to ignore. Jasmine could feel the temperature in the air shift as Marcus's presence intensified. The officers seemed to shrink, the weight of his gaze bearing down on them. The first officer shifted on his feet, trying to find a way to backtrack, but it was clear that he didn't have a solid defense. He glanced over at his partner, who remained silent, his eyes darting nervously between Marcus and Jasmine. There was something unsettling in their hesitation, something that spoke louder than any words could. Marcus wasn't about to let this go. He knew how these situations could play out, knew how easily it was for people to get caught in the web of silence, to be brushed aside without a second thought. But he wouldn't let that happen to Jasmine. He wouldn't let her be just another person in a long list of victims of injustice. No, Marcus said firmly, his voice rising slightly. This isn't right. I want to know why you stopped her. I want to know why she's being questioned when she hasn't done anything wrong. What are you really accusing her of? The first officer opened his mouth to respond but faltered, unsure of how to justify the situation. The words seemed to get stuck in his throat as he realized there was no plausible reason for what they had done. The second officer finally shifted, his arms still crossed tightly over his chest as if to protect himself from the growing confrontation. He avoided looking directly at Marcus, his gaze sliding away as if he couldn't meet his eyes. Jasmine could feel the tension building in her chest. Her mind was spinning, the weight of everything crashing down on her. This wasn't about a simple misunderstanding. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or a routine check. This was something deeper, something rooted in the assumptions they had made about her before they even knew who she was. They had judged her before giving her a chance to explain herself. It was the same story that so many others had faced, and now it was happening to her. As the silence stretched, Marcus's presence seemed to fill the space, creating a suffocating pressure that the officers couldn't ignore. His gaze was unrelenting, his posture unwavering. He wasn't backing down. He wasn't going to let them hide behind their excuses. Jasmine had never seen him like this before, so calm yet so determined. The quiet rage simmering beneath his controlled exterior made her feel both proud and terrified. Finally, the first officer sighed, his shoulders slumping as if he had given up trying to find a way out. He glanced over at his partner, who seemed to agree that there was no way to continue this charade. The air between them crackled with unspoken words, but neither of the officers dared to speak. Jasmine's heart raced, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. She had never felt more exposed, more vulnerable, and yet she also felt something else, the quiet power of Marcus's protection. His refusal to back down, to let this go unanswered, made her feel seen. It made her feel like she mattered, like she wasn't just another target in a world that often looked past people like her. In that moment, she realized how much she had underestimated Marcus's ability to handle situations like this. He wasn't just her husband. He was her ally, her strength, in a world that too often turned a blind eye to injustice. The officer sighed once more, his voice quieter now, tinged with something like resignation. "We're sorry for the confusion, ma'am," he said, his words feeling rehearsed and empty. "We were just following orders." Jasmine felt a sharp pang in her chest. Orders. That was the excuse. Orders were what had driven them to stop her, to treat her like she was guilty before even hearing her side. It was the same excuse that had been used countless times before, the same excuse that had allowed so many injustices to go unchallenged. Marcus didn't let the apology slide. He stepped closer to the officer, his voice still calm but now filled with a quiet authority that left no room for doubt. "Sorry doesn't fix this. Sorry doesn't make up for the fact that my wife was stopped without cause. Sorry doesn't take away the discomfort and fear you've caused her. So don't apologize. Just admit what happened." The officer stood there, unable to respond. The weight of Marcus's words seemed to hang in the air, suffocating the officer's ability to say anything further. There was nothing more they could say to justify their actions. The truth was now clear for all to see. Jasmine wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a human being, and she deserved better than this. As Marcus turned to look at her, their eyes met in a brief but powerful moment of understanding. He wasn't just her husband. He was her voice in a world that had too often silenced people like her. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked, his voice softer now, full of concern. Jasmine nodded, her breath catching in her throat as she tried to steady herself. She was still shaken, but with Marcus by her side, she felt the strength to stand tall. "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice barely above her breath. The officers slowly began to back away, realizing they had lost. The fight wasn't over, but it was clear who had won this battle. Jasmine felt the weight of the moment settle in her chest, but she knew this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, but she wasn't alone. Not anymore. The unraveling truth. Officers stood frozen in place as if Marcus's words had taken the air right out of their lungs. Around them, the airport carried on with its usual chaos, but in this small corner of the terminal, everything felt locked in place. Jasmine could hear the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat in her ears, and the distant hum of a luggage cart somewhere behind them. Her mind was still wrestling with the reality of the moment, and though Marcus's presence gave her strength, the sting of what had just happened was beginning to sink deeper into her thoughts. Marcus stepped forward again, his shoulders squared, his expression calm yet undeniably forceful. The first officer's eyes darted briefly toward his partner, as if looking for support but found none. The second officer shifted his stance, his boots scraping against the polished floor in a nervous movement that betrayed the control he was trying to maintain. Marcus's voice came out firm and deliberate, each word landing like a slow hammer blow that left no room for interpretation. "You've said routine check 3 times. Marcus began, his gaze unwavering. "But you have yet to explain why my wife was chosen for it," while others walked by without being stopped. "If you're going to hold her here and question her, I expect an actual reason, not a vague line about procedure." The taller officer tried to straighten his back, as though reminding himself of his authority. "Sir, like we said, there's been suspicious activity reported in this section of the terminal. We have to make quick calls at the moment. Based on what we see." Marcus tilted his head slightly, the faintest trace of a humorless smile pulling at the edge of his mouth. "Based on what you see," he repeated slowly, "do you mean her standing by the carousel waiting for her suitcase? Because that's all she was doing. Or are we both supposed to pretend that what you really saw was her skin color and decided that was suspicious enough?" The second officer's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Jasmine felt her stomach twist at Marcus's words, not because they were wrong, but because they were exactly right. She had known it from the moment they stopped her. The way their eyes had scanned her, the way they approached without even glancing at the other travelers, the way they seemed to have already made up their minds about her before a single word was exchanged, was all too familiar. The first officer's face hardened, his voice lowering as though he hoped keeping it quiet would make the conversation less noticeable to passers-by. "Sir, we do not target people based on race. We had information." "What information?" Marcus cut in before he could finish, his tone sharper now. "Be specific." The officer faltered, his mouth opened slightly but no words came out. His partner glanced away as if studying an invisible spot on the floor. Jasmine could almost feel the lie hanging between them like thick smoke. "You had no information." Marcus continued, his voice steady but with a rising edge of steel. "You saw my wife standing here alone. You saw a black woman who didn't fit whatever picture you carry in your mind of someone who belongs here, and you acted on that. I've handled too many cases like this to not recognize it." At the word cases, both officers shifted again. Jasmine could see it in their eyes, the moment they realized Marcus was not just some angry husband, but someone who knew the rules they were supposed to follow. Someone who could hold them accountable in ways they probably didn't want to think about. The taller officer's voice lost its earlier authority as he finally muttered, "Sir, we didn't mean any harm. It may have been a misjudgment." Jasmine's chest tightened. A misjudgment, that was their word for it. The hours of fear and humiliation that people like her were forced to endure could be brushed aside with that single vague excuse. Misjudgment was a word that allowed them to go home at night without confronting the truth of what they had done. Marcus's expression didn't change, but his voice softened in a way that made it even more dangerous. You do realize that your misjudgment could have gone a lot differently. You do realize that if you had decided to escalate this, my wife could have been in real danger, not just standing here having this conversation. The second officer finally spoke for the first time in minutes, his voice quieter than before. Sir, we'll make a note in the report that this was an error. Marcus let out a short breath that was not quite a laugh. An error, he said slowly. That's convenient. He turned his gaze to Jasmine now, his tone softening completely, as he asked, do you want to keep talking to them, or do you want to leave this here? For a moment, Jasmine didn't know how to answer. Part of her wanted to walk away, to put the whole thing behind her, to go home and let Marcus handle it later, if he wanted to. But another part of her, the part that had been silent too many times before, wanted to keep pressing, to make them confront the real weight of what they had done. Her voice was calm but carried the quiet strength of someone who refused to be invisible. I want them to say it. I want them to say why they stopped me. The first officer blinked at her, clearly unprepared for her to speak directly. Ma'am, we don't. You do, she interrupted, her eyes locked on his. You saw me standing here. I was the only one you walked up to. You didn't ask anyone else for ID. You didn't stop the other passengers leaving with their bags. You stopped me. Why? Silence stretched out between them like a taut wire, ready to snap. The officers exchanged another glance, this one more defeated than before. The second officer looked at the floor, while the first finally muttered something so quietly that Jasmine almost missed it. You fit the description. Jasmine's brow furrowed. What description? The officer hesitated. A woman was involved in suspicious activity earlier today. Alone, carrying a dark suitcase. Her laugh was humorless. Half the people in this airport are alone and carrying a dark suitcase. The admission was all she needed to hear. It wasn't a description that had singled her out. It was the fact that she was easy to single out. The rest was an excuse to make it sound official. Marcus shook his head, his expression one of controlled disbelief. That's the best you can come up with, he said flatly, a vague description that conveniently matches hundreds of people, but somehow led you straight to her. The officer didn't respond. Jasmine could feel the heat rising in her chest, but instead of letting it turn into anger, she took a slow breath and let her voice stay even. I hope you think about this the next time you decide to stop someone. I hope you realize what it feels like to be treated like you've done something wrong when all you were doing was waiting for your bag. Neither officer spoke again. The quiet between them now felt less like tension and more like defeat. Marcus finally placed a hand on the small of Jasmine's back, guiding her gently away. We're done here, he said to the officers without looking back. His tone carried the finality of someone who knew the conversation was over, and that he had gotten all the truth he was going to get out of them. As they walked back toward the main area of the terminal, Jasmine could still feel the weight of what had just happened pressing against her chest. But there was also something else there, sense of clarity, of knowing exactly what had taken place and refusing to let it be minimized. Marcus had helped pull the truth into the open, and now they both understood it for what it was. What neither of them knew yet was that this was not going to fade quietly into memory. This encounter was going to follow them beyond the airport, and when it did, they would have to decide whether to let it pass or to fight it head on. And deep down, Jasmine already knew her answer. The confrontation. Jasmine walked beside Marcus, her steps quick, but her mind slower, almost heavy with the lingering weight of what had just unfolded. She could still see the faces of the officers in her mind, the way their eyes shifted when they were pressed, the way their words faltered when truth brushed too close to the surface. Every step away from them should have felt like relief, but instead it felt like an invisible cord still tied them together, a reminder that injustice rarely ends neatly. Marcus glanced at her from the corner of his eye, reading the stiffness in her shoulders and the way her gaze stayed forward but unfocused. He knew that look. He had seen it on clients. He had defended on witnesses who had been forced to relive moments they would rather forget. It was the look of someone trying to keep themselves together by sheer will alone. Reached the sliding doors that led toward the main exit, but before stepping out into the damp evening air, Marcus slowed his pace. Jasmine looked at him, puzzled, but he gave a subtle shake of his head and led her toward a row of seats against the wall. He sat down and she followed, still unsure what he was planning. We're not leaving yet, he said quietly enough, so only she could hear. I called for a supervisor, and we're going to make sure this is recorded. The words hit her like a sudden wave. Not leaving yet meant prolonging the moment, keeping the emotions raw and exposed. But she understood why he wasn't going to let them walk away. As if nothing had happened, Marcus was never one to back down when there was an opportunity to hold someone accountable. They waited in silence for only a few minutes before a woman in a crisp uniform appeared, walking toward them with a firm, purposeful stride. She was older than the two officers, her silver-streaked hair pulled back neatly, and her sharp eyes scanning the space as she approached. She stopped in front of Marcus and Jasmine, her hands clasped behind her back in a stance that radiated authority. "I'm the shift supervisor," she said, her tone professional but clipped. "I understand there's been a complaint about an interaction with my officers." Marcus stood, his presence immediately filling the space between them. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. Instead, he laid out every detail of what had happened from the moment the officers approached Jasmine to the moment they admitted she fit a vague description that could have applied to anyone in the airport. His recounting was precise and deliberate, each word carrying the weight of someone who not only witnessed but understood the legal implications of every action taken. The supervisor listened without interrupting, though. Jasmine could see the flicker of reaction in her eyes. At certain points, there were moments where her jaw tightened. Just slightly, moments where she shifted her weight as though adjusting to an uncomfortable truth. When Marcus finished, the supervisor turned her attention to Jasmine. "Is this accurate?" she asked in a tone that seemed to invite brevity. "Yes," Jasmine replied, steady and clear. "They walked right past other people to get to me. They didn't say why until they were pushed to. And when they did, it was a description so vague it could have been anyone." The supervisor gave a slow nod and then turned slightly to look over her shoulder. The two officers from before were standing a few paces away, clearly within earshot. Their stances had lost all the earlier authority, shoulders slightly hunched and eyes avoiding contact. The supervisor addressed them sharply. "Is this true?" Neither officer answered immediately. The silence stretched until finally the taller one muttered, "Yes, ma'am." His partner gave a reluctant nod. Jasmine watched the exchange, feeling a strange mix of vindication and frustration. They were admitting it, but in such a minimal way, as if the less they said, the less real it would feel. The supervisor's voice hardened. "You do not stop someone without cause. You do not rely on vague descriptions when it leads to profiling. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, ma'am," they said, almost in unison, though the words lacked conviction. Marcus stepped forward, his voice calm but cutting. "I want this in your records, and I want confirmation that this incident will be reviewed, not just forgotten. When your shift ends." The supervisor met his gaze for a long moment before giving a short nod. "It will be noted," she said, "and forwarded for review." Marcus didn't look away until she broke eye contact and turned to address the officers again. Dismissing them with a sharp gesture, they walked away quickly, almost eager to vanish from sight. As the supervisor left, Marcus sat back down next to Jasmine, letting out a slow, measured breath. He looked at her with a quiet question in his eyes, not spoken but understood. "Are you all right, Jasmine?" Gave a small nod, but inside she knew the truth. All right was too generous. She was still carrying the moment on her shoulders, still feeling the way. Their eyes had weighed her down, the way the situation had spiraled without cause, but there was also a growing sense of resolve in her chest. A seed planted by Marcus's unwavering stance. When they finally stood to leave, the night air outside hit her face, cool and sharp. The airport noise faded into the distance as they walked toward their car. Marcus's hand lightly rested on her back, guiding her forward, but she could feel he was watching her carefully, measuring each step she took. "This won't just stay here," he said quietly. As they reached the car, "We'll take it further if you want." The choice lingered in the air between them, heavy but empowering. Jasmine realized then that the confrontation wasn't just with those two officers, it was with a system that allowed moments like this to keep happening, and now she had a chance to decide if she wanted to challenge it. She took a deep breath, her reflection in the car window catching the determination forming in her eyes. The evening might be ending, but the fight she was stepping into was only beginning, a powerful ending. The drive home was quiet at first, with the hum of the tires on the road filling the silence between Jasmine and Marcus. She stared out of the window, watching the blur of streetlights and passing cars, her mind replaying every detail of what had happened at the airport. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this moment would not fade into the background. Like so many others she had forced herself to forget in the past, this one was different because Marcus had been there, because they had pushed for answers, and because they had forced the truth into the open, even if it came out reluctantly. Marcus kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the console, his eyes focused on the road ahead, but his thoughts clearly on her. He glanced over once, catching the distant look in her eyes. You are quiet, he said gently, not as a question, but as an observation. Drew in a slow breath. I am thinking, she replied, her voice steady but firm. I am thinking that I do not want this to just be something that happened to me and ends here. I want to make sure it means something. Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. I was hoping you would say that, he said quietly. We can file a formal complaint, but that is only the beginning. If you are ready, we can take it further. We can make sure it is not just paperwork on someone's desk. The idea of going further stirred something inside Jasmine, a flicker of fear perhaps, but also a growing flame of determination. She had spent years brushing off subtle injustices and outright disrespect, telling herself it was not worth the fight. But this time she had a choice. She could let it pass, or she could push back with everything she had. By the time they pulled into their driveway, the decision was already taking shape in her mind. She stepped out of the car, feeling the cool night air against her skin, and followed Marcus to the front door there. Home welcomed them with its familiar warmth, but the weight of the day still clung to her shoulders. They sat together at the kitchen table. Marcus pulled out his laptop and opened a blank document. This is where we start, he said. We will write down everything exactly as it happened, times, dates, what they said, every detail. They will not be able to twist the story later. Jasmine leaned forward and began speaking while Marcus typed. She recalled the officer's words, the way they approached her, the moment Marcus arrived, and how their tone shifted as soon as he confronted them. She remembered the nervous glances, the vague description that matched half the airport, and the reluctant admissions in front of the supervisor. As the words took shape on the screen, she felt some of the heaviness lift. It was not gone, but it was changing into something else, something she could use. The more they wrote, the more Jasmine realized that she was not just recording an incident, she was building a case, not just for herself, but for anyone who might be in her position in the future. When they finished, Marcus saved the file and closed the laptop, leaning back in his chair. He looked at her with quiet pride. You were strong today, Jasmine. You stood there and demanded answers. Most people do not. Most people are too scared or too tired to fight, and I understand why. But you did not back down. Jasmine felt a small smile tug at the corners of her lips. I think I am done being quiet, she said. The fear is still there, but it is not stronger than the need to be heard over. The next few days they followed through. Marcus contacted a legal advocacy group and arranged a meeting to review the incident. Jasmine met with their team, telling her story again and again, each time with more clarity and less hesitation. Every person she spoke to confirmed that what happened was not just wrong, but part of a larger problem, one that needed more people willing to stand against it. News of the incident began to spread, first among friends and colleagues, then through the advocacy network itself. Soon an email arrived from a journalist asking if Jasmine would be willing to speak publicly about what had happened. She hesitated for a moment, knowing that speaking out could bring unwanted attention, but the thought of staying silent now felt like letting the officers win-win. She finally agreed to the interview. She did it with Marcus sitting beside her on camera. She spoke calmly but with conviction about the way she was singled out, about the vague excuses that fell apart under pressure, and about the emotional weight of being treated as guilty for nothing more than existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. She talked about the importance of pushing back, about not letting fear or fatigue allow injustice to go unchecked. The interview aired on a local news station, and within days she was receiving messages from strangers. Some thanked her for speaking out, some shared their own similar stories, some admitted they had stayed silent in the past, but hearing her words had made them reconsider. One evening a week later, Jasmine stood by the living room window watching the sun set over the neighborhood. The sky was streaked with gold and deep orange, fading into the soft blue of twilight. Marcus came up behind her, slipping his arms around her waist. Thinking about today, he asked, quietly. Thinking about all of it, she said softly. I never wanted to be in this position, but now that I am, I cannot pretend it did not happen, and I cannot let it happen to someone else without trying to change something. Marcus kissed her temple. You are already changing something, he said. It started the moment you refused to let them walk away without admitting what they did. She turned in his arms, meeting his eyes with a determined expression. This is not over, Marcus. I am not finished, and she meant it. The incident at the airport had begun as an unprovoked stop meant to intimidate or inconvenience her, but it had become a turning point. The fear she had carried had been reshaped into something sharper, something stronger. As the last light of the day faded, Jasmine knew she would carry this fight forward, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel small or powerless by those meant to protect and serve. She knew it would not be easy, and that change would not come quickly. But she also knew that silence had never brought justice. The injustice had been real, but so was her resolve, and with Marcus at her side, she felt ready for whatever battles lay ahead. The end.